You're all familiar with this scenario, even if you're one of those people that has never seen a Western movie or TV show. But it has become so baked into the popular culture in the West that you would encounter it on TV commercials. You would encounter it sometimes on children's shows, kind of parodying it. But here's the scenario. And by the way, this is what people usually think of when they think of the Western genre, whether we're talking about on film or in print. Two guys squaring off against each other in the dusty streets of town. In this case, you can tell who's the good guy and who's the bad guy by the color of their hats. So they stand. They have sometimes they have met in a predetermined way. Meet me on the street at high noon. Why high noon? Because then the sun is directly overhead and it's not in anybody's eyes, giving the other person an unfair advantage. So, on the streets, high noon, facing one another, steely eyed, with arms and legs slightly bent in this specific and unique stance that we see here. And at a certain point, one of them makes the first move, or perhaps simultaneously, for their guns. Or maybe someone does a countdown for them, or they do a countdown on the count of three, right? And you'll notice that their guns are slung kind of low on their hip and tied down so as to make the draw of the gun easier and less likely to get snagged. And then lightning fast, they both pull out their guns. Who's the fastest? Who's the fastest gun in town? And whoever draws first usually shoots with fatal accuracy, and the other person is left dying on the street or dead instantly. Now you can see here the townspeople are all rushing to get out of the line of fire. That is the formula. That is what we've been trained to think of as happening in the Old West. The question is, did it happen that way? Well, not exactly. Although there are plenty of recorded incidents of things kind of similar happening. This is not that different from an old-fashioned pre-Civil War duel, such as was fought frequently in the South, but also other parts of the country. Here you can see a famous painting of Andrew Jackson in one of his several duels. You probably know that Alexander Hamilton tried this less successfully. So it went back before the time of cattle drives and cow towns. But that's still a little bit different from the scenario that we see here, with two people facing off face to face and seeing who can pull their gun out first. Well, like I said, there are recorded incidents of something similar happening more than once in the Old West, but not nearly as often as popular culture would have you believe. In fact, if you went through the records, this is kind of an educated guess on my part. You probably wouldn't find more than 20 documented accounts of something like this during that several decade period. What did happen? Here, by the way, is a picture of Wild Bill Hickok in his famous gunfight with Davis Tutt in 1865 in Springfield, Missouri. That did unfold very much like the scenario that we saw. But more likely and more often, what happened was you had two guys that didn't like each other, or maybe sometimes two guys that didn't know each other, that got into an argument kind of spontaneously, often in a saloon while gambling or drinking, and wound up both of them just standing up and shooting at each other until one of them was dead, usually, not always. Or you have someone who doesn't like somebody, two people don't like each other, and they just happen to run into each other on the streets of town, and each one fearful that the other one is going to make good on previous threats and kill him, they start shooting at each other then. Not so often do you have this situation where you have an agreed upon meeting, kind of like an old fashioned official duel. More often it was spontaneous. And to be honest, if two people really didn't like each other and it wasn't a spontaneous thing that erupted because of a sudden argument, or a gambling incident or whatever, the most likely thing is that one would hide and shoot the other one when they went by. Because you know what? That's safer. Because in the incidents that did occur in the Old West, it was not a question of proving who's fastest on the draw. That is a Hollywood convention. The point usually was to kill the other person, right? Any way you can, the most effective way with the least amount of a risk to yourself, preferably. So that's how it often played out. We are going to look at some of the incidents of recorded gunfights, and a couple of them maybe in some detail. We're going to mention some others just to kind of see the incidents that gave rise, perhaps, to these legends. Because these things, like I said, they did happen. They didn't happen as often as you would think, but they gathered attention and made the newspapers locally. And they started to make the newspapers back in the East because people found this sort of thing compelling. And then, as we discussed in a previous lecture, people like Ned Buntline and others, writers from the East, would exaggerate these incidents, make them seem a lot more common than they were, a lot more dramatic, although it's hard to get more dramatic than two people trying to kill each other, but still. And all of that would lead to these ideas that we have, greatly magnified and exacerbated by the advent of the Hollywood film. As I said, in this video, we're going to look at some of the actual gunfights, as well as some individual gunfighters or gunmen or bad men or shootists, as they were more likely to be called at the time. We'll also look at outlaws, some individual ones and some outlaw gangs. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the conventions and the fake conventions of the gunfight. This picture here shows the standard kind of setup that you will see in movie and TV westerns, and which by today are considered, again, standard for cowboys of the era. You'll notice that, among other things, this holster is slung kind of low on the hip, so that it's closer to where your hand would be if you were standing with your hand at your sides, making it just maybe a fraction of a second faster to pull it out. You'll notice that the top of the holster is sort of cut away in a curved motion to expose the trigger, so that you will immediately have your finger on the trigger as you're pulling it out, which is different from, say, the classic Slim Jim holster demonstrated here, which is basically just a basic holster that you put the gun in, which covers the trigger guard, or what's known as the cavalry holster, which was a common issue to army troops, and also in the Civil War for officers on both sides. This kind has a flap that closes over the top of the gun that you have to unbutton or unsnap to get the gun out. So that's not designed for a fast draw. You'll notice also, finally, that there is this string at the bottom that you tie the holster to your leg with. And that is to make sure that when you're pulling the gun out, that holster doesn't get stuck and flap around, so that there is a smooth draw. This whole rig, as they're called, is set up for the fast draw. And essentially, this design didn't exist in this form in the Old West. It was something that was designed rather for Hollywood. Now here you see a couple of photos where cowboys are wearing holsters that are very similar to the modern holster and slung a little bit low on the hip. The guy on the left in the first picture and the guy in the second picture. Although there are no strings, they're not tied down as they would later frequently be in Hollywood westerns. But notice the first guy's buddy there in the first picture, the guy on the right. He has a holster that is higher up on the hip, and the gun looks like it's backwards. It's butt forward. So this guy's probably a right-handed guy also, and had his gun situated where he could reach across his waist and grab it in a cross draw motion. This photo here shows on the left, which is the guy's right hip, a modern rig, and then over on the right, which is the guy's left hip, you see the cross draw holster higher up on the hip and butt forward, which was pretty common during the period of the Old West. Here you have some other photos. The guy over on the far right has a more modern looking holster, but he's got it in the cross draw position. Guy in the middle has a Slim Jim holster high up on his hip, and the guy over on the left just has it stuck in his belt. Now, actually, these types of scenarios here were much more common than the low slung gun on the side of your dominant hand. It was pretty common for people to stick their pistols into their belt or in the waistband of their pants, or sometimes have a shorter barreled pistol that they would carry in their coat pocket. And the Slim Jim holsters were probably the most common that you would have seen. In fact, in what could be described as the very first Western movie, The Great Train Robbery from 1903, you can see here that the outlaw has what looks like a Slim Jim holster, and it's way up on his hip. This is before the Hollywood convention set in, which they did by 10 or 20 years after that, and sort of influenced the way that we think about cowboys and guns and gun holsters. Next, I've got some screenshots from this guy, Daniel Mink, who has a YouTube channel, and he's a very impressive trick shooter, and his videos are both informative and entertaining, and he's demonstrating some things here that are humanly possible to do because he's doing them, although clearly he practiced for a whole lot to be able to do these things, but B, are things that also became conventions in old westerns, especially in the older ones from like the 1920s, probably into the 60s. You don't see them as much anymore in newer westerns, but every once in a while you do, to the extent that these also seem like the sort of thing everybody did in the Old West. So first you've got him twirling his guns around, some stop motion there, which you've probably all seen. And then here you have him performing a trick that did exist in the Old West, called the border shift, which is where you toss your gun from one hand to the other, or toss both your guns from to opposite hands, either as a distraction or because you're shooting with your dominant hand and you're out of bullets, and so you switch over. And then also you have this one, which was also a real thing, called the road agent's spin. Bear in mind, a road agent is not like a real estate agent. A road agent is a highway bandit or a stagecoach robber. So here you have this this trick where it looks like you're surrendering and handing over your guns, but then you spin them around real quickly and they're pointed the other way, and you got the drop on the person who thought they had the drop on you. This one also, like I said, existed. It was written about in the time period, but that doesn't necessarily mean everybody was going around doing it or any of these things. Just like today, someone could practice a whole lot and be able to show off these tricks, but it's not quite the same thing if you were in a situation where someone who is armed is trying to kill you. These fancy tricks would either go out the window or they would not help you very much and might actually make the situation worse. And here's another one you've probably all seen. This is called fanning a pistol, where you have, let's say you're right-handed, you've got this pistol in your right hand, and with your left hand, you're very, very rapidly hitting that hammer over and over and over again until you are practically, your hand is a blur, like Yul Brynner's is in this scene from The Magnificent Seven. You see this one a lot in westerns still, and it is something that can be done, and there are people who practice a whole lot and can actually do it in an effective way, but there's not many of them. And in general, this was a very bad idea, actually, if you were involved in a life or death situation, because it's extraordinarily inaccurate. You're jerking your gun all over the place. Bullets will fly out faster, but they'll be going all over the place. Now, the very reason for doing this is the fact that revolvers in the Old West, from the time revolvers were introduced in the 1840s, were single action. What that means is that, well, as opposed to being double action, if a revolver is double action, that means you pull the trigger and two actions happen. The hammer goes back and the hammer falls down. So essentially, all you have to do to fire the gun is pull the trigger. With a single action, it doesn't work that way, because all the pulling the trigger does, the single action it does, is make the hammer fall down. But it's not in place yet. You have to actually cock the gun, pull back the hammer, then pull the trigger. And that's the purpose of this fanning of the gun, to make the gun shoot faster, because you're making that hammer go up and down really fast, but probably not very effectively. The first double action pistols were introduced in the 1870s, not long after the Colt Peacemaker in 1873. And you can see here, these are both Colt weapons. Standard single action there on the bottom, and then the first Colt double action, which is there on the top. The problem with the double action ones in the 1870s and 80s is that they were kind of fragile, and after you used them a few times, the spring would often break. And if that spring breaks on you while you're in a life or death situation, that's very problematic. So these guns were not very popular, the double action ones, the early ones, until later on, when that was addressed and fixed. And most guns, most pistols, most revolvers have been double action since probably the 1890s. But it's the single action revolver that kind of led to that whole fanning the gun situation, which, again, you see it here with Yul Brynner and the Magnificent Seven, and you see it all the time in old westerns and even in newer ones. And really, it's also mostly a Hollywood convention. I say mostly because it was always possible to do, but it's very, very difficult, almost impossible to do effectively. It kind of reminds me of something else that has happened with more modern guns and movies. So we've talked a lot about revolvers. That's the type of pistol, the six gun, where there's this chamber that revolves every time you pull the trigger. Eventually, you saw the invention of the automatic or semi-automatic handgun, like the 1911 Colt automatic that's shown there in the upper left. That's kind of the standard look for automatic handguns ever since. And as you can see, this doesn't have the little cylinder that revolves. Bullets come in a clip, and you stick the clip up into the hand grip there, and then every time you pull the trigger, automatically, the bullet fires, and then the shell casing ejects out of the right side of the gun, and the next bullet pops into place. With a revolver, you would fire 6 times, and then you'd have to take a break and empty out the empty shells from that cylinder. Now, this type of gun was designed to be fired this way, but more and more often in movies and sometimes in real life, when these things happen in real life, you see them being fired this way, sideways. Now, you didn't used to see that very often in movies. There's a couple of examples in old westerns from the 1960s, a couple of scenes where a character fired a revolver sideways like this. One of them was in the movie One-Eyed Jacks with Marlon Brando, and the other one was a scene in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly when the ugly guy did it. But it was very, very rare. However, starting in the 1990s, it became not only common, but by this point, it has become the norm in movies. And that started because of a couple of very successful films in the early 90s, Menace to Society and Boys in the Hood, where you had characters firing the gun like this. The director of at least one of the directors of one of those movies said that he had seen this happen in real life in a robbery, and so he wanted to convey that. Um, there's a couple of reasons that it's done this way in the movies. The biggest reason is that it allows you to have a clear look at the actor's face while he's shooting the gun. If you're like zooming right in on him, and the gun is turned sideways like it is here in this picture with Russell Crowe, you can see Russell Crowe's face. The problem is in real life that this significantly affects the accuracy of the weapon. There's that sight on the front of the barrel that you're supposed to use to aim with, and that sight helps you to adjust for wind and for gravity affecting the bullet. Turned sideways, you're not really aiming, you're pointing, and gravity affects the bullet a little bit differently as well. It also affects things like, well, remember that thing with the shell ejecting. Problem with this in real life is those hot shells are going to be ejecting right in your face, as opposed to out of the right side of the gun, so that they will go to your right and behind you. So, short statement, make a long story short, this is an extraordinarily inaccurate way and potentially dangerous way to fire a gun, just like the fanning of the revolvers was, but it looks cool on film. The problem is that after seeing a bunch of films, a lot of people think that's the right way to do it, and then that's how they do it, and that can lead to problems. Finally, another thing that has been shown in Western media since the early 20th century is the cowboy or the gunfighter that has two guns and uses them both simultaneously and effectively. Now, you would have to be ambidextrous to do that, and some people are. but most people aren't. This would not be, for most people, a very effective way of handling guns. To wrap up this discussion about fancy tricks, fancy gun tricks in the mythological West, and how things actually played out in the real West, let's look to Wyatt Earp, who knew a little something about using guns to kill people, to be honest. And this is something that he said late in life during the time that Hollywood movies had been showing these fancy tricks on screen for some time. Here's what Wyatt Earp had to say about those Hollywood cowboys who were, always spinning their guns around and tossing them around in the air and so forth. He described such a person as, quote, a fool or an amateur who would not last long in proficient company, end quote. Well, now, as advertised earlier, we're going to look at some actual gunfights from the period. And before we start that, before we start looking at post-Civil War, Wild West cowboy era gunfights, I want to look at this one here that was just a few years before that, right before the Civil War. Well, I said 1855, but it was actually late December 1854. This took place in Northern California during the gold rush, and it involved this guy here, Jonathan R. Davis. Well, I say this guy here, someone who probably looked kind of like this guy here. We don't really have a photograph of him, but Davis was a former Army officer, former Army captain that had served in the U.S.-Mexican War, and he and two companions were traveling on the American River in Northern California when they were attacked by a gang of outlaws, 13 guys, and it was an internationally diverse gang because there were people from all over the world there in California during the gold rush. So this gang had two Americans, two Englishmen, one guy from France, four Mexicans, and four Australians. And they had, the day before, they had robbed and killed a group of four American miners. The day before that, they had robbed and killed six Chinese miners. So this was their daily exercise, I guess. They attacked Davis and his companions, and in short order, his two companions were killed. Davis drew both of his revolvers that he was carrying. He didn't shoot them both at once, I guess, but he drew them both and emptied them at the attackers and killed 7 of them with his revolvers and then ran out of bullets. So he took out his Bowie knife and killed 4 more. And the 2 who were left ran for the hills and escaped with their lives. There was another group of miners approaching who witnessed the whole thing. So we know that it actually happened. This really was one of those larger than life, hard to believe incidents such as are portrayed in movies and seem unrealistic. But this is a case where it actually happened. In the previous lecture, we talked about Wild Bill Hickok's 2 most famous gunfights. His first one and his last one, as it turned out, not counting his own murder because he was shot in the back of the head while playing cards. That didn't really qualify as a gunfight. That was just murder. Last video was about famous lawmen, so we went into this in detail. But I'm going to hit the highlights just in case you missed that one. First one was with Davis Tutt. I mentioned that at the beginning of this lecture video. Happened in 1865 in Springfield, Missouri, right after the end of the Civil War, during a time that Wild Bill Hickok was making his living as a gambler, and so was Davis Tutt. Initially, they got along pretty well, even though Hickok was a Union veteran and Tutt was a Confederate veteran. But they started to have problems. They started to have issues revolving around women and around gambling debts, and things came to a head in an argument about a pocket watch and a gambling debt. Tut had taken Wild Bill Hickok's prized pocket watch and from a debt that he claimed Hickok owed that Hickok said was not the amount Tut said it was. And after that, Tut was just sort of brandishing that watch and showing it off, daring Hickok to do something about it. And he did. On the town square, he advanced on Tut with his revolver in his hand, and both of them raised their weapons and fired at virtually the same instant, but Tut missed and Hickok did not, and Tut wound up dead. And this was the incident that was widely reported and wound up being written about in Harper's Magazine, which was a national magazine that made Wild Bill Hickok famous, made him a bit of a celebrity. Then later, when Hickok was the town marshal in Abilene, Kansas, a cow town, he had similar issues with a guy named Phil Coe. Phil Coe, also a gambler, co-owned a saloon and gambling house called the Bull's Head. He co-owned it with Ben Thompson, a famous Wild West gunfighter that we'll talk about in a little bit. Thompson and Hickok got along okay initially, but Hickok and Coe never did. And things came to a head there, no pun intended, at the Bull's Head Saloon, due to the fact several people in the town had complained about Thompson and Coe and the way they decorated their saloon, which was they had a picture painted on the wall outside the saloon of a bull with a fully erect penis. And so Hickok demanded that they take that down or cover it up, and Coe refused, and Hickok apparently painted over it himself. And so they had harsh words. And then one night, Hickok was out on the street having, I think, just broken up a fight, and Coe was on the street as well. Coe saw him and took a couple of shots at him from across and down the street, missing both times. And once again, Hickok did not miss. He shot Phil Coe dead. And then, hearing someone running up behind him, he whirled around and shot that person dead. And that turned out to be his own deputy that was coming to help him. So that was a bit of a blemish on Hickok's record, and wound up being the last killings that he did, despite the fact that he still lived for almost right around 5 more years after that before he was murdered. So Wild Bill Hickok sort of made into a larger-than-life figure, but he actually had been in some shooting scrapes, a couple of which were very, very reminiscent of the sort of thing that you do see in the movies. Of course, the most famous gunfight in the Old West was the gunfight at the OK Corral, or more accurately, the gunfight near the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, on October the 26th, 1881. We talked about that one in some detail last time as well. Plus, you're probably pretty familiar with it. I imagine most everybody has at least heard about it. But put succinctly, you had the 3 Earp brothers and Doc Holliday against 5 of the cowboys led by Ike Clanton. That resulted in them standing in front of each other and shooting at each other for about 30 seconds, and 3 of the cowboys being killed. So anyway, you can go back and hear what we had to say about that last time. I'm going to instead go to one that maybe you haven't heard about, and that was a gunfight between Luke Short and Jim Courtright in Fort Worth, Texas in 1887. They were also known by the sobriquets Lucky Luke Short and Long-Haired Jim Courtwright. We've mentioned Luke Short a couple of times before in previous lectures. Here he is on the left, looking kind of dapper, and then there he is in the picture that we just saw, and the famous photograph of the Dodge City Peace Commission, so-called, quote unquote, there on the right. A little bit of background about Luke Short. He was a Texan, and in 1869, when he was 15 years old, he started working as a cowboy, and did so for about 6 years, making multiple trips from Texas to the railheads in Kansas, Abilene, and then later Dodge City. Then in 1875, he became a scout for the U.S. Army, serving under General George Crook. And he was serving in that capacity in 1876 during the Great Sioux War in the Black Hills in Dakota Territory. And he was involved in several actions during that war in combat. After that, he became a gambler and kind of traveled around the West, and was involved in several shooting incidents, at least 3 or 4 that I can think of, including one in 1881 in Tombstone. Yes, Tombstone we were just talking about. Luke Short got hired on as a faro dealer at the Oriental Saloon, which was co-owned by Wyatt Earp. And he was there during the time period that Bat Masterson had gone out to Tombstone to help his friend Wyatt Earp get his gambling establishment started and underway. And it was there that a friend of Bat Masterson's, a guy named Charlie Storm, started picking on Luke because he looked kind of Luke Short was short and of slender build and very unassuming looking, and he would have seemed like easy prey for a bully who did not know him personally or know about his activities, which Charlie Storm did not. And there was a scuffle, which was carried outside the Oriental Saloon onto the sidewalk. Bat Masterson, who was friends of both guys, tried to break it up, but then Storm apparently grabbed Luke Short by the ear with his left hand and pulled a gun on him with his right, whereupon Luke Short shot him 3 times and killed him. After that, he wound up going to Dodge City later in 1881, where he became part owner of the Long Branch Saloon, and that was his occupation for a couple of years. Then in 1883, the mayor of Dodge City, a guy who did not get along well with Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp, Larry Deeger, ran Luke Short out of town, essentially. And as a result, Short called upon several of his friends to help him. And they showed up. That's all these guys in the picture down here, including, well, you can see Short in the back row, looking all short and stuff. And right next to him on the right is Bat Masterson. And sitting in front of him and to the left is Wyatt Earp. Didn't come to any kind of violence, anything beyond the intimidation of these guys showing up, because there was pressure on the mayor also from the town council and several businesses, because, well, the way that he got rid of Short was to pass several laws limiting immorality in the town, and then accused Short of violating them. Well, Dodge was a cattle town, and you can't make any money as a business person in the cattle town if your immorality is curtailed, because the drinking and the gambling and the prostitution is what made the money. So he was allowed back in. Now, after that, in I think 1884, he moved back to his native Texas, first to San Antonio for a while, and then to Fort Worth, where he became part owner of a different saloon, one called the White Elephant. Jim Courtwright was the marshal in Fort Worth, Texas in 1887. Originally from Illinois, he had served in the Union Army during the Civil War when he was a teenager, but had distinguished himself and come to the attention particularly of his commanding officer, General John Logan. After the war was over, Courtwright wound up serving as a deputy sheriff in Fort Worth, Texas, served for a while as a deputy United States Marshal, and for several years was a private detective, by which we mean actually he was a hired gun. And during that time, he worked for mine owners and large ranchers who wanted to clear squatters off their land, except it wasn't actually their land, it was public land. And the squatters usually were people who had legally filed claims for it. And Courtwright was apparently involved in the murders of several such squatters, quote unquote, or farmers. Then later he became the town marshal in Fort Worth, Texas. And while he was town marshal, apparently the murder rate was cut in half. Courtwright killed several people in the performance of his duties, and then he killed several more people not in the performance of his duties. He actually had a protection racket going on in Fort Worth. So essentially, he as town marshal would come up to your business and say, nice little business you got there, be a shame if anything happened to it. If you pay me to protect you, nothing will happen to it, but if you don't, something will, right? And apparently, he made this quote-unquote offer to Luke Short, the owner of the White Elephant Saloon, who told him, yeah, no thanks, I think I can handle it. Marshal Jim Courtwright, alias Long-Haired Jim, alias Big Jim Courtwright, was not amused by Luke Short's resistance to pay up, and he made several threats against him, making it clear that if he saw him in public, bad things might happen. Well, not long afterward, one day, Marshal Courtwright was walking down the street in Fort Worth, and Luke Short was walking down a different street. And they both rounded the corner and ran into each other, essentially. Now, oddly enough, Bat Masterson was here with Luke Short again. In fact, I think he was walking down the street with him, and he witnessed the whole thing, as did several other people. So what happened was that Short had his thumbs in his vest pockets, and when he rounded the corner and saw that it was Courtwright, he took his thumbs out of his vest pockets and tugged at the bottom of his vest to straighten it up, at which point the marshal called out, "Oh, pull a gun on me, will you?" And reached for his gun, which he wore butt first. And Luke Short also quickly drew his gun. So this is almost like the ideal example of the Wild West quick draw gunfight, in which how quickly you get your gun out and who shoots first really did matter in a big way. And Short was a little bit faster in getting his gun clear of the holster, and he got off the first shot. However, he didn't have time to aim. He just took it out and shot. So he didn't kill Jim Courtwright. Instead, he shot off his right thumb. Now, remember what we said about single action revolvers and the fact that you have to cock them with your thumb. So Jim Courtwright's there with his gun in his hand, but he can't shoot it. And so he's kind of befuddled there for a split second. And then he tried that border shift maneuver that we saw earlier. That is tossing his gun over to the other hand, But while he was doing all that, Luke Short shot him 3 more times and killed him. Bat Masterson and a bunch of other people witnessed it, and even though there was a hearing, Short was it was ruled self-defense because people had seen the marshal go for his gun first, and apparently unprovoked. Well, after that, by the way, Courtwright was 39 years old when this happened. After that, Short moved around some more, was involved in 2 or 3 more shooting incidents, and hanging out with Bat Masterson, got involved in the prize fighting profession. Again, like Masterson, not participating, but betting on it. And he actually wound up serving as a referee in several prize fights and worked as a fight promoter for a little while. Finally, in I think it was 1893, maybe, Luke Short had developed kidney disease and edema, and he actually died from that disease at the age of 39, same age that Courtwright had been several years earlier when he had shot him. Another famous gunfight took place that same year, 1887, over in Arizona in Apache County. And this one involved the Blevins brothers, who were involved in the Pleasant Valley War, a war between two competing, between a cattle rancher and a sheep farmer, and the men that worked for them. And the Blevins brothers were deeply involved in that on the side of the ranch owner. And the sheriff of Apache County, a fellow named Commodore Perry Owens. By the way, he was named after Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, the hero of the War of 1812, not that Commodore Perry's younger brother, Commodore Matthew Perry, the guy that strong-armed his way into Japan in 1854. Anyway, Perry is what he went by. That is this sheriff, Perry Owens. He had been born in Tennessee. His family moved to Indiana when he was very young. His family, by the way, were Quakers. And when he was 13, he ran away from home and headed west and became a buffalo hunter and a cowboy, and eventually a lawman. After some youthful indiscretions in 1877, for example, he was arrested by deputies riding for Judge Isaac Parker in Indian Territory for illegally selling liquor. Also, he may have been involved in some rustling as a younger man. Once he became a lawman, he was involved in a couple of shootings. One of them in which he shot a young Navajo boy that he accused of rustling. Actually, he wasn't a lawman even at that time. He was the foreman of a ranch. But that did not result in charges, even though it seemed a little suspicious to some people. Anyhow, 1886, Commodore Perry Owens was elected the sheriff of Apache County after serving as deputy sheriff for a year or so. And when he took office, there were a couple of things going on that the locals were concerned about and hoped that he would take care of. One of them was that Pleasant Valley War, and particularly the Blevins brothers, a notorious couple of brothers. And then the other problem was another rancher and his group of cowboys, a guy named Ike Clinton that you should recognize. He was one of the people involved in the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone. It was the Clanton group that the Earps were at war with. Ike Clinton had survived that gunfight at the OK Corral by beating a hasty retreat. But now, having survived both that and the ride of vengeance that the Earps took afterward, and by 1886, he's here in Apache County operating a ranch. He's quoted as saying during that time period, ranching is easy when you don't have to buy the cows. He was accused of rustling, and in a big way. Well, Sheriff Owens was responsible for trying to put a stop to that, but he did not seem to be getting too far with it, despite his very colorful dress in this picture. Turns out, and I don't know if this is because of his Quaker upbringing, he was very slow and by the book. Now, looking again at this photograph of him, take note. He's got that pistol there slung on his hip. He wore two pistols, and he actually was ambidextrous. He really could shoot both of them accurately at once. In fact, one of the tricks he used to do to amuse people was to shoot a tin can shoot it across a field, shot by shot, alternating shots between his two guns. He also was a very good rifle shot and could fire his rifle from the hip without aiming and usually hit what he was trying to hit. Anyway, a lot of the local ranchers got impatient for his slow approach to gathering evidence, I guess, and stuff, and they hired a stock detective, a fellow named Jonas Brighton, alias Rawhide Jake. This is a photo of him much later when he was an older man. Rawhide Jake, stock detective. Sounds like a TV show. Anyhow, Rawhide Jake worked closely with Owens and his deputies, and in fact may have been deputized by the sheriff. Anyhow, he was with one or two of the county deputies when they caught Ike Clinton in the act. And Rawhide Jake shot him dead, and then later shot one of his men as well. So that's the end of the Ike Clinton story, kind of indirectly here, because he wasn't killed by Commodore Perry Owens. He was killed by Rawhide Jake, but it was Perry Owens adjacent. All right. Well, by 1887, the time we're talking about, Commodore Perry Owens had cut his hair and dressed more conservatively as befit an elected office, I suppose. But we still use the older picture because it's so flashy, I suppose. Anyhow, the Blevins brothers, involved in that Pleasant Valley War, and had acted on behalf of the ranchers' family to get vengeance on some of the shootings of the ranchers by the other side. They'd killed some people, and Andy Blevins was also wanted on an outstanding warrant for rustling. So Sheriff Perry Owens went to Andy Blevins's cabin to serve that warrant for rustling. Now, on the day that he went there, Andy Blevins was there, so was his wife with their infant son, so was Andy Blevins' brother John, and so was their kid brother Samuel Houston Blevins, who was 15 years old. Also, a young lady, friend of the family, was there. Also another guest, a guy named Mose Roberts, and several children. So it was a house full. And Sheriff Commodore Perry Owens shows up, knocks on the door. Andy Blevins answered the door with a pistol in his hand, and the sheriff informed him that he was serving a warrant on him for his arrest, so you'd better come peacefully. But he didn't come peacefully. He tried to slam the door, and the sheriff put his foot in the door, literally foot in the door, and fired through the door with his rifle, had his rifle in his hand, and mortally wounded Andy Blevins. Then went into the room where there were a lot of screaming women and children in this tiny shack, and there was the other Blevins brother, who was also armed. He took a quick shot at him, hit him in the shoulder, which took him out of commission, and then the sheriff backed back out the door to get a look at the house so he could see all three sides at least of the house, and that's when he saw someone with a gun in their hand climbing out the window. That was Mose Roberts. Roberts had a gun in his hand and turned toward the sheriff, who then shot him dead. And at this point, the kid brother, 15 years old, picked up Andy Blevins' pistol. Andy Blevins was lying on the floor bleeding out, and in anguish swore that he'd get revenge, even though his mother tried to hold him back. And he ran out the front door, pistol in his hand, to shoot the sheriff. And Sheriff Owens shot him instead, hit him in the chest, and killed him. So when all was said and done, you had one wounded Blevins brother who is now under arrest, and you had two dead Blevins brothers, and also a dead accomplice. So essentially, the sheriff here killed. Well, I don't know if you could call the kid an outlaw, but he just certainly was armed, and he certainly was intending, apparently, to kill the sheriff. So three armed men, actually four armed men, who were firing at him. I forgot to mention that John Blevins actually got a shot off at the sheriff and missed him, and instead hit his brother's horse that was outside. So anyway, this was a kind of a Hollywood-worthy gunfight that, again, seems almost unbelievable. One guy against four who were armed and shooting back. But it did happen. And after this, Sheriff Perry Owens didn't really, do anything that outstanding for the rest of his career. He got defeated for re-election later on, wound up dying of kidney disease, much as Luke Short had, although he lived to be a bit older. He had dementia when he passed away. But due to his colorful name and his colorful appearance and the undeniable grit displayed on that particular day, he was still written about a lot in his lifetime and afterward. In our previous lecture, I talked about young Bat Masterson and his first gunfight, which took place in 1875 at Fort Elliott, Texas, when Masterson, after having been a buffalo hunter for a while, being at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, and then serving as a scout for the U.S. Army, wound up in Texas and got into an altercation with a cavalry corporal named King over a woman that led to the two of them shooting at each other in the woman's presence, with Masterson killing the cavalry corporal and the Corporal King managing to shoot Masterson in the hip, shattering his hip. And that's the reason that Bat Masterson used a cane or a walking stick for the rest of his life. So I've already, talked about Bat Masterson quite a bit. The reason I'm bringing him back up is one thing I did not mention when I discussed this then, is that after the shooting, turns out the corporal had a lot of friends, a lot of fellow cavalry troopers who were essentially howling for Bat Masterson's blood, but someone stepped in. Someone stepped in and saved his life, essentially, cowing the crowd of troopers and dispersing them. And it was this guy, Ben Thompson. If you remember the lecture about Bat Masterson, you'll remember that Ben Thompson came up quite a bit. Thompson was one of, at the time, one of the best known and most feared gunmen in what we now refer to as the Wild West, but he's kind of been lost to popular culture and popular history Unlike those folks that I talked about then, there have not been any movies made about him. And kind of like, if you'll recall, when I discussed Bill Tillman, he showed up from time to time as a supporting character or someone wandering through in some of the old TV westerns, but not a household name. However, Bat Masterson felt quite a bit differently and was quite fond of him, not only fond of him, but very respectful of his abilities in an emergency. So let's take a look at Ben Thompson. Born, actually, in England. When he was about 8 years old, his family left England and moved to Texas, moved to Austin, Texas. I've often wondered if he had any trace of an English accent as an adult. Anyhow, as an adult, he joined the Confederate Army at the beginning of the Civil War, and throughout the war, he was involved in several battles and skirmishes, along with his younger brother Billy, who joined the same unit he did, including the Battle of Galveston, probably the biggest battle that he was involved with. When the war ended, Ben Thompson was one of the many Confederate veterans who did not surrender and did not hand over their weapons, and instead headed south of the border to Mexico to serve as mercenaries, essentially, in the Mexican Civil War. Now, that period of war in Mexico had started in 1862. And it started when the government of France, using as a pretext the fact that the liberal president of Mexico, Benito Juarez, who was the first fully indigenous person to be president of Mexico, and I don't think there's been one since, I may be wrong. Anyhow, Juarez had ceased loan repayments to France, Spain, and Great Britain. So France used that as a pretext for war with the support of Spain. So the French actually invaded Mexico with the goal of overthrowing the Juarez government and installing instead an emperor, this guy Maximilian, who was Austrian, who would serve as the emperor of Mexico under the control of France. Now, there were some Mexicans, some extremely conservative Mexicans, who actually had sided with the French on this because they didn't like Juarez. So Maximilian was installed as emperor in 1864, even though Juarez was also still around. So there were like two governments operating at once. Does that sound familiar? That's sort of like the U.S. and the Confederacy. It's even sort of like the Cherokee Nation during the Civil War. Anyhow, the United States refused to recognize Maximilian as leader. They still recognized Benito Juarez as the leader, and they viewed France's actions as a serious violation of the Monroe Doctrine that had been in place for about 40 years. If you are familiar with that, if you remember that, that's when President James Monroe essentially said to Europe, stay out of our business here in the Western Hemisphere. Well, U.S. government viewed France as violating that, but there wasn't a whole lot they could do about it because the American Civil War was going on. So the French kind of took advantage of that. And actually, Cinco de Mayo was that is not a celebration of Mexican independence. That's celebrating an event that took place a little over 40 years after Mexican independence. The event was the big Mexican victory over the French forces early in that war on May 5th, 1862, the Battle of Puebla, which did not result in Mexican independence, nor did it even sustain Mexican independence because the war dragged on a long time after that, but it was a big victory. Anyhow, the fact is, getting back to the story, that Ben Thompson and other Confederates came in after the American Civil War was over on the side of Maximilian. as long as he paid them. So they were fighting for him. And with the American Civil War over, the U.S. government was now free to take a hand. They were no longer preoccupied with their own rebellion. So they were funneling funds and ammunition and stuff to the Juarez side. So essentially, Ben Thompson and those other Confederates, those other rebels, were still fighting against the U.S. government, in addition to having picked sides here in this Mexican situation. And it ended the same way for them, which is they lost. Their side lost. 1867, Maximilian was captured and executed, and the Juarez government was secure in place. So that one didn't work out either. So Thompson and most of those Confederate expatriates then went back home to the United States. Thompson went back home to Texas, where he heard that his brother-in-law had been mistreating his wife, Ben Thompson's sister, beating her and so forth. So he decided to teach him a lesson, and the lesson was almost fatal. Not quite, but his brother-in-law was severely injured, and Thompson was sentenced to 2 years in prison at the Huntsville prison in Texas, very famous prison. He didn't serve out his full 2 years, though, because he was pardoned. And after he was pardoned, he left Texas, like a lot of cowboys were doing, and headed north to Kansas. By 1870, Ben Thompson had moved to Abilene, Kansas, which was the terminus of the Chisholm Trail, and as we have discussed, was a really hopping place by about that time. And he took on a partner, Phil Coe, and together they opened a saloon called the Bull's Head Saloon. If you recall, there was some controversy about the painting that they had on the outside of the building, controversy that led to some issues. By the way, here's Ben Thompson looking a little more dapper, as a business owner should. Anyhow, the whole situation with the bull painting and other things led to friction between them and Wild Bill Hickok, who was the marshal of Abilene. And the friction was a little bit more between Coe and Hickok than between Thompson and Hickok. But Thompson sided with his partner. And in fact, when a Texan gunfighter named John Wesley Hardin showed up in town, Thompson and Coe kind of egged him on to get him to fight Wild Bill Hickok. In fact, Thompson said that Hickok was a damn Yankee that loved to push around rebels, especially ones from Texas, which both he and Hardin were. Hardin's response was, if you want him dead, why don't you kill him? And he didn't do anything. In fact, Hickok heard about the exchange, and he approached John Wesley Hardin later that same evening, and Hardin turned his pistols over to Hickok, and there was no issue between the two of them. But there was an issue between Hickok and Thompson and Coe. It so happened that Thompson had been injured shortly after that in a fall from a horse, and he wasn't up and mobile at the time that his partner Phil Coe thought it would be a good idea to try to shoot Wild Bill Hickok. And as we have discussed, that turns out to have been a very bad idea for Phil Coe, a fatally bad idea. Not long after that, Hickok left Abilene, and so did Ben Thompson. He went just a little bit farther west to Ellsworth, Kansas, which was also a hopping place because by then it had become the second terminus of the Chisholm Trail. The Chisholm Trail diverged in Indian Territory, and some of those cattle went to Abilene, some of them went to Ellsworth. He was soon joined in Ellsworth by his younger brother Billy. And as I mentioned last lecture, Billy Thompson was a little problematic for his older brother. He tended to cause problems. Anyhow, the two of them are there in Ellsworth, Kansas, and they got along well with the county sheriff, a guy named Chauncey Whitney, who by all accounts was extremely popular, very well liked and respected, as befits someone who's able to get enough votes to be county sheriff. But they did not get along with the town marshal, a guy named Happy Jack Morco. There's no photos of him that I'm aware of, so I used this one just so we can visualize a little bit. Anyway, Happy Jack Morco was reputed to be corrupt. He was a little bit of a bully, and he had, well, Ellsworth had one of those ordinances that said you could not carry sidearms inside the city limits. And so he was often, he and Sheriff Whitney and their deputies, the only people that were armed. And so perhaps that gave him a little sense of freedom to throw his weight around with someone like Ben Thompson, whom he accosted one day while Thompson was gambling, and essentially was bullying him around him, and another fellow was helping out, and a guy named Sterling, I think. There had been an argument between Thompson and Sterling about money, and the whole thing went outside the saloon. At that point, the sheriff had heard about what was happening, so he showed up to try to defuse the situation and calm everybody down. And Billy Thompson also heard what was going on, and he was extremely inebriated already. He grabbed a shotgun and ran to his brother's defense, but he stumbled, and one of the two barrels of the shotgun went off right into Sheriff Chauncey Whitney. Ben Thompson thereupon cried out, "My God, Billy, you've shot our best friend." And Billy said, "I'm sorry." And Sheriff Whitney, with his dying breath, said it was an accident. He didn't mean to do it. So at this point, the sheriff expired. Ben actually, he had a rifle by that time. I'm not sure if maybe he had retrieved that from his horse. And he held off Happy Jack and I think the guy's name was Sterling, held them off while he got Billy onto his horse and urged him to get the heck out of town, which he did. And afterwards, Morco actually put out a $500 reward for Billy Thompson, but no one claimed it. In fact, Happy Jack wasn't able to claim too much after that because he got fired because the town council viewed him as having started the whole thing, essentially. So he was out of a job. A couple of years later, he actually got killed, got shot in an argument and confrontation with the one of the deputies of the new town marshal, a deputy named Charlie Brown. Anyway, after Happy Jack was out of the picture and it was safe to come back to Ellsworth, Billy Thompson returned and stood trial for the killing of Sheriff Whitney and was acquitted, people having viewed it as, the jury viewing it as an accident. However, all this led to Ben Thompson to decide that maybe Ellsworth's not the place to be anymore. So he left and went back to Texas. Not to his stomping grounds of Austin this time. He actually wound up in the Panhandle at Fort Elliott, Texas, by 1875. The shooting of Whitney, by the way, that took place in 1873. It was in 1875 at Fort Elliott that Thompson met and befriended Bat Masterson, and it was there that he stepped in and defended Masterson after Masterson had shot Corporal King, and they became lifelong friends as a result of that. Now, after this, Thompson moved back to Austin, Texas, which was his stomping grounds, and it was around 1879, 1880 or so, that he was contacted by his friend Bat Masterson, who by this time was the county sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, where Dodge City was. And Masterson asked Thompson to help him out. Thompson became part of the small army of gunfighters that Bat Masterson raised to go out to Colorado to participate in the Colorado Railroad Wars, which was a situation where two different railroads were arguing with each other. And Masterson was hired by the Santa Fe Railroad, which never came to exchanging shots or anyone being killed. It just sort of like moved over to the courtroom as the battleground between those two companies, and the group dispersed. After that is when Ben got word his younger brother Billy, who had fled to Ogallala, Nebraska after the killing of Whitney, was in trouble again because apparently he had shot the thumb off of a lawman in Ogallala, and he was in jail. Thompson asked his friend Masterson, who was very well known and very popular, to see if he could go up there and rescue Billy Thompson. And Bat agreed, and along the way ran into Buffalo Bill Cody. And the two of them actually went and negotiated the release of Billy Thompson. This is how Ben Thompson and Buffalo Bill became friends. Buffalo Bill actually gifted him with a very rare and expensive handgun after this. So Thompson had made a profound influence on Buffalo Bill and on Bat Masterson, who later wrote, quote, "It is doubtful if in his time there was another man living who equaled him," that is Thompson, "with a pistol in a life and death struggle." So Bat Masterson was around quite a bit, witnessed quite a few altercations, and was involved in quite a few. So when he singles you out for praise for your ability to handle yourself, really means something. By the way, after having met Buffalo Bill, Ben Thompson actually worked briefly in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Somewhere around that time, Thompson got into another gunfight after an argument with a saloon owner, Mark Wilson, owner of the Capitol Theater and Saloon, and I believe that was in Austin. Wilson opened fire on Thompson after a disagreement, and missed. Thompson then, according to the witnesses, was very calm and steady in his response. He drew out his weapon, and while bullets were whizzing around him from the, I guess, probably nervous Wilson, he shot Wilson 3 times and killed him. At this time, Wilson's bartender, a guy named Charles Matthews, produced a Winchester from behind the bar, and he took a shot at Thompson and also missed, and then ducked down behind the bar. And Thompson actually fired through the bar and hit the bartender. Didn't kill him, but wounded him pretty severely. So this is kind of a bit of evidence of, first, what Bat Masterson had said about Ben Thompson, that he was extraordinarily cool and competent under fire, and also harking back to our earlier discussion in this video about fancy gun tricks and fast draws and stuff like that, and the fact that in real life, none of that mattered very much. What mattered was, if you had someone like Ben Thompson, who, in addition to being in various quote-unquote gunfights, had also fought in 2 civil wars and been under fire many times, and was somewhat, I guess, I don't know if you could say used to it, but he was able to keep his cool and his composure while the people trying to kill him were panicking and therefore missing. In fact, in an interview, Thompson once said that his policy is to let the other person shoot first, so that then he has self-defense on his side, trusting to the fact that whoever draws their gun and shoots first is probably going to be nervous and miss. So this is one of the, I think, most dramatic of the gunfights that are documented from the Old West. Anyhow, after that, Thompson, by 1881, actually was hired by the city of Austin to be the city marshal, and because Austin is the capital, they called it chief of police, and he got to have a uniform and everything. And he served that position for about a year. At the end of that year, while he was still the chief of police in Austin, took a trip out to San Antonio to gamble. And he got into an argument with a saloon owner there in San Antonio, owner of the Vaudeville Theater, which is really a saloon, a guy named Jack Harris. Thompson and Harris actually had bad blood going back a couple of years, stemming from a previous visit Thompson had made to San Antonio and the Vaudeville Theater and Saloon. After which Harris had said at the time that if Thompson ever came back to the saloon, he was going to get a shotgun and blow a hole through him big enough for a cat to jump through. Anyhow, here it is a couple of years later, and Thompson is in fact back in town. He does go into the saloon, says some nasty things about Harris, and then left. Harris had seen he was there in the saloon, so he had gone to get a shotgun, and he comes back. So by this time, Thompson is outside on the sidewalk, and Harris is standing just inside the saloon, raises his shotgun, and Thompson shoots him twice through the open door, and kills him, which leads to some problems for Thompson there in San Antonio, because quite a few people really were fond of Jack Harris there, although there were some that were not. Anyhow, he's put on trial for murder, but acquitted because the jury rules it self-defense. And a lot of people in San Antonio are not very fond of Ben Thompson after that. Now, the people of Austin were very fond of him, and they cheered when he got off the train, when he got back home. But the city council, not as amused, because after all, he was supposed to be there in Austin preserving the peace, not off in some other city having gambling disputes and getting involved in shooting. So they fired him. And that was the end of his career, his very brief career as a lawman. But he stayed on in Austin, opened actually, he had already opened a saloon that he was running. I think it's called the Iron Horse, that he was running while he was the chief of police. Now, a couple of years later, Thompson found himself back in San Antonio on business, and he ran into an old friend of his and fellow gunfighter, a guy named King Fisher, who by this point had become a very successful rancher and was also in San Antonio on business. So naturally, they decided to shut down some bars and saloons, by which I mean, hang out and keep drinking until the place closed down. They wound up meeting up with a couple of acquaintances at none other than the Vaudeville Theater and Saloon, the very place where Ben Thompson had killed Jack Harris. So their acquaintances led them to a table, and then the acquaintances disappeared, at which point Thompson and Fisher both knew something was up, and that's probably, just about the last thing they knew, because a large group of Jack Harris's friends had been there waiting for them, and opened fire, and the two men went down in a hail of bullets. Kingfisher was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ben Thompson came back to the wrong place at any time. And that was the end of the line for both of them. Well, now let's talk a little bit about John Wesley Hardin, whom we mentioned just a few minutes ago in connection with Ben Thompson and Phil Coe and Wild Bill Hickok. Hardin was from Texas and had his troubles from a young age. At the age of 14, he stabbed another kid at school. Then, at the age of 15, he shot and killed his uncle's former slave, a guy named Mage. And believing, he and his father, believing he would not get a fair trial for murdering a black guy for no apparent reason in Texas during Reconstruction when it was occupied by federal troops, Union troops, many of whom were African American, he decided to lie it out. He said that he was pursued by 3 Union soldiers at one point whom he killed, 2 of them white guys and 1 a black guy. And so here he is at the age of 15 on the run, and apparently he's already killed 4 people. Now, I could talk at great length about all the incidents that we know he was involved with and all the incidents that he claimed to have been involved with. He was prone to brag, and he was prone to exaggerate, but on the other hand, there were 14 killings at least that there's documented evidence that he did. So he definitely killed 14 people. If you go through all of his claims in his autobiography and things that he said to reporters, he claimed to have killed at least 23 more beyond that 14 number. And if you go through both the number of people that he did for sure kill and the number of people he claimed to have killed, you will see kind of a trend. He shot a lot of black people, and he shot a lot of Mexicans. So make of that what you will. Anyhow, by the age of 17, he was working as a cowboy, trailing herds up to Abilene, and that's where he met Wild Bill Hickok, Phil Coe, and etc. He was kind of starstruck by Wild Bill Hickok, and really just sort of almost like a fanboy in the fact that he was actually able to meet him and interact with him, even get to know him a little bit. And apparently Hickok had a little bit of a soft spot for him, although Hardin claims that he outdrew Hickok. There were no witnesses if that did happen, and nobody got shot. Anyhow, here you can see in this painting, it reflects the fact that John Wesley Hardin was also one of those guys like Perry Owens who wore 2 guns and could use both of them effectively. And he had, you'll notice there, butt forward. He did a cross draw, which he practiced, according to his own account, a lot. And eventually, well, before we get to eventually, let's talk about how he wound up leaving Abilene. He was actually in Abilene 2 or 3 times. On one occasion, he was there with his cousin and a good friend of theirs, a guy named Charlie Cougar. I think his first name was Charlie. Anyway, they were hitting the town and drinking heavily, and they rented rooms at a cheap flop house, I guess you would call it, cheap hotel. And Hardin and his cousin were in one room, and Cougar was right next door in the other room. And this is kind of a cheap place. It had thin walls. And Cougar who was very drunk, was snoring really loudly and keeping Hardin from falling asleep. So John Wesley Hardin knocked on the wall and yelled several times to Cougar saying roll over. And finally, just angry, he just started shooting into the wall, claiming that his intent was to wake Cougar up. But he did the opposite because he shot him right through the heart, through the wall. and he expired there. When that happened, Hardin and his cousin decided that rather than hang around and try to explain that to the marshal, Wild Bill Hickok, perhaps they should just leave town, which they did. And after that, there was just one incident after another after another. By the way, Hardin's father had been a Methodist preacher, and that's why he named him John Wesley. So, for people around my age, I was born in 1968, grew up in the 70s. People my age or older, the very words John Wesley Hardin might bring to mind this image right here of Jack Palance, the bad guy in Shane, in these commercials that he did in the 1970s and 80s for Time Life Books for their Old West series of books. And in the commercial, he specifically told very briefly, well, he didn't tell the story, he just showed the most famous image of John Wesley Hardin in the white hat and said that he once shot a man for snoring too loud. And that stuck with a lot of people. That may have actually made John Wesley Hardin well known again because, he was not sort of on the level of a Wyatt Earp or Bat Masterson throughout most of the 20th century. Anyhow, finally, 1877, he got successfully arrested. I say successfully because he had actually escaped from custody at least a couple of times. But he was arrested in Florida and sentenced to 25 years in prison for one of his murders that they were able to have evidence on. And he went to prison in 1877 and served 17 years of his 25-year term. He got out of prison in 1894 when he was 40 years old. Now, while he was in prison for all those years, he became the superintendent of the prison Sunday school. He studied law books, and upon his release, he was actually pardoned by the governor of Texas and took the bar exam and passed it and became a practicing attorney in Texas in 1894 and 95. Now, he was still a little prone to his old ways. There's one story of an incident where, on a bet, he fired a bullet at I think, an elderly Mexican man who was, I think, sleeping on a large box, betting that he could knock him off the box. And he did, and the guy died. But he died from the fall, not from being shot. Anyhow, someone like John Wesley Hardin, who might have been sent to prison for years for killing, deputy marshals and so forth, was not arrested for killing a Mexican guy or any of the African Americans that he killed for sure or possibly. Anyway, Hardin also, well, I said he's had a little bit of his streak of his past way of life. He was walking down the street with his girlfriend, his mistress, a woman who was, well, by some accounts at least, a known prostitute, and she was armed. And a young marshal's deputy named John Selman Jr. arrested her for brandishing a firearm in public, and she wound up being fined $50, which was a big chunk of money back then. And this angered her boyfriend, John Wesley Hardin, who confronted Selman and pistol whipped him, buffaloed him, beat the crap out of him. And that annoyed John Selman Sr., who was the constable there in El Paso, but who had for many years been an outlaw and a rustler, and had himself a reputation as a gunman. And he and Hardin had sharp words about Hardin's treatment of his son, and nothing came of it at that moment. But then that night, Hardin was in a saloon playing dice, and Selman came into the saloon. Selman Sr. walked up behind him and shot him in the head, and then shot him 3 more times as he lay already dead on the floor. Selman Sr. was arrested, but there was a hung jury, so they couldn't get all 12 of them to agree on his guilt or innocence, and so he was set free with the understanding there was going to be a retrial. However, the retrial never happened because Selman, in the meantime, got in an argument with a deputy United States Marshal in a card game, and that resulted in a shootout, and Selman was on the losing end of that one, and he was killed. So within a short time, both of these former desperados and gunmen exited this mortal coil. Now we're going to talk about another individual who's not a household name, but is regarded and was regarded as one of the most dangerous gunmen in the West, Clay Allison. Clay Allison was from Tennessee, from Wayne County, Tennessee. And when he was about 20 years old, the Civil War started, and he joined the Confederate Army. He served in the cavalry under General Nathan Bedford Forrest of Tennessee. Perhaps you've heard of him. At the end of the war, the story goes, he came back home, and the state, like much of the South, was initially occupied by Union soldiers, and a Union soldier from Illinois had forced his way into the Allison home. Perhaps the story goes with the view of taking over the house or of looting the house, and while arguing with the family, knocked over and broke Clay's mother's favorite vase that had been an anniversary gift to her from Clay's father. And she was horribly distraught about it. And Clay, who wasn't home at the time, when he got home shortly afterward and heard the story, grabbed his rifle, ran down the Illinois soldier, and killed him. Now, shortly after that, the entire family left Tennessee, which is to say that Clay and all of his brothers and sisters and all of their families left Tennessee and moved out to New Mexico, to the town of Cimarron, which is in Colfax County there in northern New Mexico. The story goes that shortly after arriving there, within a short time, that there's a situation that developed. There we go again with those developing situations, in which there was a local guy who had been accused of waylaying, robbing, and murdering a large number of strangers who had been passing through. And actually, the guy's own son had gone missing. And all their bodies were found at his house, and the guy was arrested. Clay Allison led a mob to the jail and broke the guy out of jail and killed him. And Allison cut the guy's head off and stuck it on a fence post. Well, he was kind of wild and rowdy, particularly in his younger days, and he was a danger to those around him, and some said a danger to himself. He drank a whole lot. One time he accidentally shot himself in the foot. On another occasion, a little later on, down in Texas, there was an incident where he got drunk and galloped his horse through the town of Mobeetie, Texas, stark naked except for his gun belt. So anyway, There in Cimarron, Allison began to get involved with what was known as the Colfax County War. Now, that's another one of those range wars. The situation in Colfax County is this. The same year that Clay Allison was born, 1841, when New Mexico was still a part of Mexico, the Mexican governor of New Mexico had made a land grant, 2.7 million acres in northern New Mexico, to a couple of individuals, including Guadalupe Miranda, who was the mayor of Ciudad Juarez, a very prominent Mexican family. 1849, that guy, Miranda, formed a partnership with an Anglo, a U.S. citizen, a guy named Lucian Maxwell. And so they became partners in this $2.7 million land grant. And Maxwell had the job of running essentially the land and the grant. And he was very amenable to people using the land. He allowed a whole lot of settlers who came in to build houses on this huge land grant. U.S. settlers, also some people who were Mexican by birth, now U.S. citizens in some cases, whether they wanted to be or not, and also even some Native Americans he allowed to build homes on this huge grant. But then, right around the time, or shortly after, that the Allisons moved in, that land grant was sold to this huge company called the Maxwell Land Grant and Railroad Company. So now there's a single owner, a corporation, if you can, well, corporations are people, aren't they? A single corporation controlling the whole thing. And they demanded that all these people who had settled there, including the Allisons, get out. At this point, I think Maxwell I think he may have passed away. Anyhow, this led to friction between the settlers, who believed that that this had been their home, and the company, who viewed them as squatters. And the company employed several gunmen as enforcers to try to force the settlers to get out through intimidation or even murder. And Clay Allison, was one of the leaders of the settler group. During the same time period, he also got into an argument with a guy named Chunk Colbert, who was a gunman that had come into the area. And there was some bad blood between them already, involving Clay Allison and one of Colbert's relatives. And it was no secret that Colbert had it in for Clay Allison, but he invited him to dinner. And so they went to a restaurant and sat down and had dinner together. And over the course of the dinner, Colbert drew his pistol from under the table to shoot Clay Allison. However, he was a little clunky about it, and the pistol kind of hit the edge of the table, slowed him down a fraction of a second, which is all that Clay Allison needed, having been prepared for this eventuality and expecting it, to draw his own gun and shoot Chunk Colbert dead. Now, people asked him, why did you accept a dinner invitation from somebody that you knew wanted to kill you? And he said, well, I don't want to send a man to hell on an empty stomach. And that quote got around and added to his growing legend. And then there was another incident even more directly related to the Range War. There was a gunman, a hired gunman, named Cruz Vega, who, it was strongly suspected, had murdered one of the settlers. and Clay Allison killed him in retaliation. Well, Cruz Vega had an uncle, Francisco Grieco, who swore revenge on Allison and walked in on him while he was drinking in a saloon, and a gunfight ensued in which Francisco Grieco met his demise. Much like John Wesley Hardin, Clay Allison was involved in really too many gunfight incidents for us to go into detail on all of them or even mention all of them in the time we have available. But it is worth mentioning that Allison also got in a lot of knife fights, and his most famous one was a duel that he engaged in with another guy, in which a grave was dug, both of them stripped naked, and a Bowie knife was tossed down into the grave. And I believe they had each had one hand tied to the hand of the other guy, and they both jumped down into the grave with no clothes so that they couldn't conceal any weapons. And whoever came back up alive, why, that was the winner, and it was Clay Allison. Now, eventually, Allison kind of calmed down a little bit as he got older, moved from New Mexico down to Pecos, Texas, where he operated a ranch and was married and had several kids. And then he finally met his demise in a very un-gunfighter-like way. He was, you can see here a little bit of age on him. He's around 45 years old by that time. He was driving a wagon full of supplies, and it hit a rut in the road and bounced, and a sack of feed went flying off the wagon, and he leaned over to try to catch it, and lost his balance and fell, and the wagon ran over him and broke his neck. Now, I have heard versions of that story where he was drinking heavily, but I'm not sure if that was actually a factor or not. But that was at the hands of fate, an accident of fate, the end of the notorious Clay Allison. Well, we can't talk about Old West gunfighters without at least mentioning Doc Holliday, even though Holliday has literally shown up many, many times already in our lectures, particularly during our discussions of Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. So we won't go into the same detail here that I've already gone into, but a little bit of background about John Henry Holliday, alias Doc Holliday, born in Georgia in 1851. In fact, his father was the mayor of Valdosta. He attended dental school in Pennsylvania, and this is, in fact, his graduation picture from 1872 when he was 20 years old, a little bit before his 21st birthday. Once he turned 21, he started practicing dentistry there in Georgia. Now, bear in mind that at this time period, even in 1872-73, Reconstruction is still going on in the South, and Union soldiers are occupying the area. So one day, when young Dr. Holliday and several of his friends went onto his uncle's property to go swimming in their favorite swimming hole, when they got there, some African American Union soldiers were there swimming in their swimming hole. And Holliday was outraged, had a shotgun on him, as he often would throughout the rest of his life. And according to most stories, he fired it over their heads and ran them off, scared them away. Although Bat Masterson later said that Holliday had told him that he had killed a couple of them. which there's no evidence for, but it would not be surprising at all. Anyhow, this kind of should remind you of something that we talked about 2 or 3 lectures back, and that's the fact that generally speaking, not universally, but generally speaking, in the late 1860s through the 1870s in the Old West, lawmen tended to be Union veterans, like Wild Bill Hickok, for instance. Even some of the corrupt lawmen we've talked about today, like Happy Jack Morco and Long-Haired Jim Courtright, were Union veterans. Or in some cases where they were too young to have been in the war, perhaps they had older siblings who were. Whereas, generally, the gunfighters and outlaws were more likely to have been former Confederates. And just today, we've talked about Ben Thompson and Clay Allison, and then some others who were perhaps too young to have been in the Civil War, but who were definitely Confederate, pro-Confederate in their sympathies, like Doc Holliday, Luke Short earlier on, John Wesley Hardin, and so forth. Anyway, Holliday, not long after he had started his practice, learned from a doctor that he had tuberculosis, which had killed his mother a few years before. He was told he had tuberculosis and he only had a few months to live. So he decided to try to prolong his life by going out west, where the air was drier and it was easier to breathe. So he moved out to Dallas, Texas, and opened a dentistry office there. While he was there, he learned also something else he learned. He's pretty good at gambling and he enjoyed it. And before long, he was making more money gambling than he was pulling teeth. In fact, this came to the attention of the authorities and he was fined for illegal gambling and wound up leaving Dallas. He went up to Denver, and then he went to Cheyenne for a while. Wound up in 1876 at Deadwood in the Dakota Territory as a dealer at the Bella Union Saloon. And if you have watched the HBO TV show Deadwood, which you should, the Bella Union should sound very familiar to you. Anyhow, he traveled around the West gambling, and there were several incidents in which he was involved with shootings, although not nearly as many as John Wesley Hardin, not quite as many even as Clay Allison. But he had developed a reputation as being able to handle himself, being a smooth customer. He also picked up a girlfriend along the way, an Austrian immigrant, known to most people as Big Nose Kate, which I think is unfair. She was a saloon girl and sometimes worked as a prostitute, but after meeting and falling for Doc Holliday, her full-time job was being the girlfriend of Doc Holliday. Basically, she followed him around the West everywhere that he went, right up to his dying day. Now, by this point, we're in like 1877, 78. Not long after that is when he met Wyatt Earp in Texas initially, when Earp was trying to track down Dave Rudabaugh. And shortly after that, he and Big Nose Kate packed up and moved to Dodge City, where Wyatt Earp lived, and he opened a dentistry office there. After his time in Dodge, he didn't even bother trying with the dentistry anymore. He was just a full-time gambler. And it was while he was there in Dodge that the incident we discussed last time, where he saved Wyatt Earp's life in a saloon when a group of angry cowboys had the drop on on Deputy Earp, and Holiday stepped in. So then he became lifelong friends with Wyatt Earp. And pretty much from that point forward, his orbit was kind of a synchronous orbit with Wyatt Earp. They were practically inseparable for several years. He followed Earp out to Tombstone, Arizona. He was involved, of course, in the gunfight at the OK Corral. Afterwards, he was heavily involved in the ride of vengeance that Earp took against the Clantons after his two brothers were shot. Finally, though, they did part ways after Holiday apparently made some anti-Semitic remarks about Wyatt Earp's girlfriend Josephine Marcus, who became his final common law wife. So after that, they sort of parted ways, and Holiday and Big Nose Kate floated around the West from place to place. I had mentioned this is actually before Tombstone and the OK Corral that Doc Holliday was one of the gunfighters that were employed by Bat Masterson for that railroad war out in Colorado. Finally, he passed away around the age of 36 of tuberculosis. And he had been given a few months to live, and he managed to turn that into 14 years. And that was the end of Doc Holliday, but certainly not the end of his legend, which, much like Wyatt Earp's, got a big boost by Stuart Lake in the 1930s, and had also been boosted by Bat Masterson in his writings. And, well, as you know, Earp and Holiday, as you probably know, have been portrayed on screen many, many times. Difficult to pick out the standout for Wyatt Earp, maybe, but most people think the Val Kilmer performance was the best Doc Holliday on screen, and I think that Kirk Douglas probably was a close second on that one. But this is at least one name that students usually recognize. All right, well, that wraps up this one. Next, we're going to talk about outlaws and the outlaw life.